In the dark expanse of the galaxy where stars burned like jewels suspended in a velvet void, there was one truth that everyone knew. The universe runs on energy. For every species that had risen from the ashes of their home worlds, the secret to survival was power. But no one ever expected it to be so absolute, so unyielding as it was for the Qatari. Their civilization had conquered entire galaxies, spreading their influence with a singular truth. Energy was everything. And yet, in the deep, unseen pockets of the universe, humanity had endured, resilient, relentless, and stubborn beyond reason. They didn't rely on energy, not in the way the galaxy understood it. They thrived on something else entirely, something so irrational it was almost a kind of madness, spite. Commander Alex Vance sat in the command chair of the Prometheus, an old Terran battleship barely holding together. His fingers drummed against the armrest, restless. The ship's engines were sputtering, its systems barely hanging on, but somehow it still flew, still fought. Just like the human race. The universe, vast and indifferent, had decided that humanity was a problem that needed to be erased. The Qatari hegemony, with their hyper-efficient society, had decided that humanity's biological need for combustion, for energy in its rawest, most chaotic forms, was a flaw, a mistake in evolution. Humans consumed too much, burned too brightly, and never played by the rules. Worse yet, humanity's will to survive could not be measured in the scientific terms the Qatari revered. Vance had grown up hearing stories about the Great Struggle, humanity's last war against the Zethar Dominion, a battle for their very survival. Now, he fought with the knowledge that the Qatari had deemed Earth a failed experiment. The universe had been offered a chance to end humanity's existence, to rewrite the equation of life and death. The Qatari were going to see to it that humanity would no longer burn. But then came the Spite Core, a weapon powered not by energy, not by logic, but by human rage, defiance, and the refusal to kneel. Vance's crew had been assembling at the EUI Hidden Research Station on Epsilon 7, a barren cold world far from any Qatari patrols. They had been led here by a lone signal, a desperate cry from Dr. Miriam Zhao, a scientist with a mind sharp enough to cut through the veil of the galaxy's expectations. The message had been cryptic, but the meaning was clear. They had discovered something powerful, something that could change everything. It wasn't long before the Qatari fleet had caught wind of the station's location. They had come in force, their dreadnoughts and sleek cruisers descending upon the small moon with unrelenting precision. The Spite Core was humanity's last hope, but it was buried deep beneath the surface of that world, a secret too dangerous to allow to exist. Now, as the Prometheus dropped out of warp and into the cold embrace of Epsilon 7's orbit, Vance stared out through the ship's reinforced viewports. A deep silence had fallen over his crew, one that only the bravest or the most foolish could ignore. Prepare for combat. Vance's voice cut through the tension, steady despite the pressure building in his chest. He wasn't afraid, but that didn't mean he didn't feel the weight of what was about to happen. The Qatari were relentless, calculating. If they found the Spite Core, the human race would be wiped from the annals of existence. No more rebellion. No more defiance. Just another footnote in the galaxy's cold, efficient history. But Vance knew humanity's greatest strength wasn't in its weapons or its technology. It was the sheer refusal to give up. The stubbornness that ran through their veins like fire. It was their ability to fight when every other species would surrender. And today, that defiance would be their weapon. As the ship neared the surface of the station, Vance's comms officer, Lieutenant Sophia Morales, called out with urgency in her voice. "Commander, we're being hailed by the Qatari flagship. They demand our immediate surrender. They know we're here." Vance's lips curled into a thin smile, the kind of smile that came before a storm. "Tell them to hold their breath," he said. "I don't negotiate with tyrants." His words were a declaration not just to the Qatari but to the universe itself. Humanity had long been underestimated. The galaxy had written them off as an evolutionary error. But they had survived. The Zethar, and they would survive the Qatari. They didn't need to play by the galaxy's rules. They would make their own. As the Prometheus descended into the planet's atmosphere, the crew braced for what was to come. The station's defenses were crumbling, the station's distress signal barely audible over the Qatari's attempts to scramble the transmissions. Vance's thoughts raced, not just with tactics, but with something deeper. What would happen if they failed? Would humanity truly be wiped from the stars? Would their legacy be reduced to nothing more than a dangerous anomaly? There was no time to dwell on that now. The ship's thrusters fired, and the crew braced as the Prometheus broke through the station's protective barrier. The Qatari had already begun their bombardment, targeting the station's reactors with pinpoint precision. The humanity's only advantage now was the Spite Core, but if it fell into the hands of the Qatari, if they understood how to use it, it could mean the end of everything. The station's core was hidden deep beneath the surface, surrounded by the remnants of its once imposing defenses. As Vance and his crew made their way through the facility, the hum of the Spite Core grew louder. It was almost alive, pulsing with a rhythm that matched the pounding of his own heart. Humanity ran on spite. They had survived because they never knew when to quit. No matter how much the universe tried to stamp them out, they always found a way. They always pushed forward. And now, they had a weapon that could change the balance of the entire galaxy. A weapon powered not by logic, not by efficiency, but by human will. Vance's boots clanged against the metallic floor, his mind sharp, his every step sure. The time for diplomacy had passed. There was no negotiation, no surrender. This was humanity's fight, and they would win, not because they were smarter, not because they had the best weapons, but because they simply refused to lose. The Spite Core was humanity's last hope, and it would burn brighter than anything the galaxy had ever seen. The Prometheus lurched violently as it dropped into the planet's atmosphere, the ship's hull groaning in protest against the harsh winds and turbulence. Vance braced himself, hands gripping the edge of his chair, eyes locked on the chaotic swirl of clouds and jagged terrain that stretched out below. 5 minutes to station, Lieutenant Morales announced, her voice tight but calm. We're taking heavy fire from the Qatari, but we're still on course. Vance's gaze flickered to the tactical screen. Red blips flashed across the display, Qatari ships sweeping into the station's orbit, their precision targeting beams shredding through the station's fragile defenses. The station's outer hull was already buckling under the weight of the assault, a series of violent detonations rippling through its structure. Hold steady, Vance muttered, his jaw clenched. This was the moment. This was the line humanity had drawn. If they didn't act now, they might never get another chance. The Qatari knew they were coming. There was no hiding from the most efficient military force in the galaxy. The Prometheus wasn't stealthy. It was stubborn. It wasn't supposed to be here. It wasn't supposed to make it this far. But somehow, it had. Commander, Morales's voice cut through his thoughts again. We're being hailed. It's the Qatari flagship. Put it on screen, Vance ordered, already knowing what was coming. The holographic display flickered, and the image of a Qatari officer appeared, a tall, sharp-featured figure with eyes that glowed an unnatural green. Their skin shimmered like polished stone, an unnatural perfection that mocked humanity's imperfections. Commander Vance, the officer said, voice cold and unyielding. Your defiance is noted. You are out of time. Surrender now, and we may allow you to join the ranks of more efficient species. Resist and we will obliterate your fleet, your species, your world. Vance's eyes narrowed. You know what happens next. You know we won't surrender. The officer's lips curled into a smile. So be it. The transmission cut off without further ceremony. Weapons hot, shields up, Vance ordered, the finality of the moment weighing heavy on his chest. We're going in. The Prometheus shot downward, its engines roaring as it punched through the thick atmosphere. The ship's hull rattled with each impact, but it held firm. It always did. Vance had been through far worse than this. Drop us in the heart of the station's control center, he commanded, eyes scanning the readouts as they approached. The station was just ahead, its once mighty walls now a crumbling skeleton of its former self. Qatari warships circled overhead like vultures waiting for the final breath of their prey. "We've got incoming," Morales warned. 3 Qatari fighters closing in fast. Vance didn't flinch. "Fighters are irrelevant. They don't know what we're carrying." His crew didn't need more explanation. The moment the Spite Core had been activated on the Prometheus, they knew what it meant. It was the key to their survival, something that made no sense in a universe obsessed with efficiency, and yet it had become their greatest weapon. The more they were pushed, the stronger they became. Human resilience, defiance. It was a force the Qatari had never encountered before, and they were about to learn the hard way. The ship shook again as another barrage slammed into its shields. Sparks flew from the control panels and the lights flickered. Morales was already rerouting power, her hands flying over the console. "We're almost there," she shouted, voice tinged with strain. Vance nodded. "Once we land, we move fast. Everyone knows their role. This station is our last hope. We can't let them take it." The ship's landing gear hit the ground with a heavy thud, and the doors slammed open. Vance, followed by his team, charged out into the dimly lit hallway of the station. The stench of burning metal and singed circuitry filled the air. Lights flickered overhead, casting long shadows along the walls. The Prometheus might have been battered, but they had no time to waste. The Qatari wouldn't give them an inch. The crew sprinted down the narrow corridors, their footsteps echoing off the cold metallic floors. Every wall, every corner seemed to close in on them as the urgency of their mission settled in. Vance's comms officer, Ensign Reyes, kept him updated on the external situation. 2 Qatari warships are closing in, Commander. We've got about 10 minutes before they send in reinforcements. We need to get the Spite Core and get out now. Understood, Vance replied, his voice a low growl. They were out of time, but he could feel the power surging within him. This was humanity's fight. They didn't need to play by the rules. They just needed to survive. The door to the central chamber slid open with a hiss, and the room beyond was bathed in the sickly green glow of alien technology. Vance stepped into the chamber, eyes immediately locking onto the Spite Core, a jagged crystal-like structure, pulsing with an unnatural rhythm. It throbbed, as if alive, a raw, chaotic force contained within. Dr. Miriam Zhao stood beside it, her face pale but resolute. Her hand was poised above a control panel, fingers trembling slightly. "Commander," she said, her voice strained, "we've activated the Spite Core. It's working, but I'm not sure how long it will hold. The Qatari will stop at nothing to destroy it." "Good," Vance replied, his gaze never leaving the pulsating core. "Because we won't let them." Without warning, the station's alarms began to blare. A deep rumble shook the room. "The Qatari are here," Zhao muttered, her eyes wide. "They've breached the outer walls." Vance didn't flinch. The ship outside was only the beginning. The real fight was happening right here, right now, and it was the moment humanity had been waiting for. The Spite Core hummed louder, almost like a heartbeat. There was a strange power in the air, an electric charge that surged through the room, the walls vibrating in response. The station's power grid was flickering, struggling to maintain coherence. "Zhao," Vance said, his voice tight with urgency. "What's the Spite Core's capacity? How long can we use it?" She met his gaze, her eyes filled with an unsettling mixture of awe and fear. "It draws its power from human emotion, from our defiance. The more pressure we're under, the more it works, but it's unstable. If we push too hard, then we push as hard as we can," Vance interrupted, his eyes narrowing. He could feel it now, the surge of energy coursing through the station, filling him with purpose. The Qatari might have their precision, their efficiency, but humanity had something far stronger: the refusal to back down. Just as Zhao began to input new commands into the control panel, the lights overhead flickered and died. The room was plunged into darkness, only the Spite Core's pulse illuminating the chamber in an eerie glow. The door burst open with a crash. Qatari soldiers flooded the room, their sleek, energy-based weapons drawn. They didn't hesitate. They were efficient. They were perfect. And humanity? Humanity was about to show them what it meant to survive, even when the odds were impossible. The Qatari soldiers poured into the chamber with terrifying precision, their sleek, battle-armored bodies moving in perfect synchronization. Their weapons hummed with lethal energy, and for a moment it seemed as though the station itself trembled beneath their presence. The room grew tense, electric with the anticipation of a battle that would decide humanity's future. Vance didn't flinch. His hand moved instinctively to the sidearm at his waist, but he knew they couldn't win this fight with brute force alone. The Spite Core was their trump card. They just had to keep it active long enough for it to make a difference. "Get the core to the ship," Vance barked. "Morales Reyes covers Zhao while she moves it. We're not leaving here without it." Zhao, though pale from exhaustion, nodded without hesitation. Her fingers moved swiftly over the control panel, locking in the core's power to her suit's portable harness. The Qatari soldiers had already begun to advance. Their cold, calculating, eyes fixed on the humans in the room. Vance wasn't about to let that happen. He drew his sidearm, its familiar weight steady in his grip, and fired without warning. The energy beam struck the nearest soldier square in the chest, sending it stumbling back, sparks flying from its chest armor. The Qatari didn't scream, they didn't panic. They moved like clockwork, calculating, mechanical. But the violence of the attack, humanity's refusal to die quietly, seemed to disturb their perfect rhythm. They shifted, moving in tighter formations, their weapons glowing brighter. "Damn them," Vance muttered. The Qatari had no understanding of the fury that humans could harness. The more pressure they put on the human spirit, the stronger it became. But if there was one thing humanity knew how to do better than anyone, it was survive, by any means necessary. "Zhao, move," Morales shouted, as she fired a blast that caught one of the Qatari soldiers in the shoulder. The impact sent the soldier crashing against the wall, its body limp. But there were more, many more. Zhao gritted her teeth, eyes darting to the Spite Core. She had to keep it stable. The surge of power that came with every use of the core was unpredictable. If they overused it, the resulting energy backlash could tear the station apart along with any hope they had left. "I've got it," Zhao said, voice tight as she yanked the core's harness into position. Her body jolted as the core's energy poured into her suit's systems, feeding off her own exhaustion, fear, and most importantly, her defiance. Vance could see it. The Qatari were faltering. They didn't understand what they were up against, but they were starting to realize that the humans weren't like the other species they had conquered. Humanity's strength didn't come from logic or energy or even technology. It came from something far more unpredictable. A deep growl erupted from one of the Qatari soldiers. Its eyes glowed brighter now. As it adjusted its aim, a secondary weapon emerging from the shoulder of its armor. With a screech, it fired a burst of green plasma straight toward Vance. Without thinking, he dove to the side, just as the blast tore through the spot where he had been standing. The heat from the explosion scorched the wall beside him, but he didn't hesitate. Rolling to his feet, he fired again. This time, a well-placed shot to the soldier's chest. The soldier fell, crumpling to the ground with a hiss of static, as its systems went offline. But the others were still coming. They didn't need fear or panic to guide them. They were programmed for perfection, and in that, they were relentless. "We can't hold them off forever," Reyes said, her voice tight as she fired another round at a Qatari soldier advancing on their position. The Qatari flinched at the shot, but it only slowed for a moment before it charged forward again. The soldiers weren't what worried Vance, though. It was the damn ship. The Qatari flagship above them, still in orbit, was sending in reinforcements, faster than they could clear the hull. If they didn't get Zhao and the core back to the Prometheus soon, they were done. "Zhao, move!" Vance shouted again, his voice harsh. He could feel the tension building, the rising sense of urgency that accompanied every battle. "We need to get you out of here now. They'll destroy the station if they get their hands on the core." Zhao's hands trembled as she adjusted the harness once more, ensuring the core was secured. "I can't move it without more power. It's not stable yet. If I push it too far, it could overload. It's not ready." Vance's eyes locked with hers, his heart racing, a bead of sweat dripping down his temple. Do it anyway, he said, his voice like steel. We don't have a choice anymore. The Qatari were closing in. They knew they couldn't defeat the core without destroying the station, but they had already started positioning their forces to neutralize the humans first. They weren't just soldiers. They were tacticians, and they understood the value of suppressing a threat before it could become dangerous. Vance could feel the heat of the plasma rounds as they whizzed past him, each shot a reminder of how little time they had left. He moved to block the door, covering his crew as they made their way down the hall toward the exit. "You won't make it," a Qatari commander shouted as he appeared in the doorway, flanked by several of his elite soldiers. But Vance wasn't intimidated. He didn't have the luxury of fear anymore. Humanity had been underestimated from the beginning. Now they would show the galaxy just how wrong they were. "Morales, Reyes," Vance barked. "Get the core to the ship, I'll hold them off." The two women exchanged a brief glance but nodded without hesitation. There was no time to argue. As the team split, Vance dropped into a crouch behind the nearest wall, aiming his weapon toward the advancing soldiers. The Qatari commander raised a hand, signaling his forces to fan out. They moved in perfect sync, creating a deadly perimeter around the humans. "Human," the commander called out in his cold, guttural voice. "This is pointless. Surrender, and we will spare your species." Vance's lips twisted into a grim smile. "Spare us," he repeated. "We're done with the galaxy's idea of mercy." The Qatari didn't understand defiance the way humanity did. To them, survival was a calculation, a cold, efficient process. But to humans, survival was something personal. It wasn't just about logic or strategy. It was about heart. The spite core pulsed again, brighter now as Zhao poured more of her will into it. It was unstable. She could feel it, but it was becoming something more. Humanity had always been at its best, when it was pushed beyond its limits, and now the spite core was doing the same. It was fed by their anger, their refusal to bow down to the Qatari. The more pressure the enemy exerted, the stronger the core became. The Qatari were closing in, but Vance wasn't worried. The core would be their salvation. All they had to do was survive long enough to use it. Outside, the Prometheus was waiting, the battle-scarred ship ready to leave the station's orbit. The Qatari reinforcements were closing in, but the crew was moving faster than expected. They weren't just running, they were fighting for their very existence. Zhao glanced back at the team, her eyes fierce. "We're going to make it," she said, her voice quiet but resolute. The door slammed open once again, and the sounds of Qatari soldiers charging forward rang out through the hall. The Prometheus was their only hope. Vance could see it now, hanging just outside the station's shattered walls, its engines roaring as it prepared for liftoff. But the Qatari had already begun their final assault, their ships closing in like a swarm of predators on a wounded animal. The station was falling apart, and the battle had only just begun. Vance stood at the heart of the control room, the door barely holding against the weight of the Qatari onslaught. The station was now a maelstrom of flashing lights, collapsing walls, and the acrid stench of burning metal. His fingers gripped the sidearm tighter, the weight of his decision settling on him like a physical thing. "We're out of time," Morales said, voice grim. She was covered in cuts and bruises, but her eyes were hard. There was no fear left in her, only determination. "If we don't leave now, we're dead. The Qatari are pushing through every level." "Zhao," Vance called, not taking his eyes off the door. "I've got the core." Zhao's voice crackled through the comms, barely audible over the chaos. "But it's unstable. If we activate it again, it could implode. The entire station, everything could be destroyed." Vance hesitated for only a second. Then he turned, meeting her eyes across the room. "Then we activate it. Right now. We either take this fight to them or we die trying." Zhao nodded, but her face was lined with exhaustion and fear. She didn't want to do it. No one did. But they had no choice anymore. The Qatari were efficient, but humanity was resilient. The Prometheus was still there, hovering above the station. The Qatari warships circled like vultures, waiting for the inevitable destruction. But Vance had a different plan. "Reyes, Morales, Fall back to the ship, he ordered, his voice low, but unyielding. Zhao, initiate the core, give it everything you've got. For a moment there was silence. The door to the control room rattled again as another blast shook the station. The Qatari were close. So damn close. I can't guarantee. We'll make it out, Zhao said, her voice shaking. The core? It doesn't matter, Vance interrupted. We'll either win, or we'll go down fighting. Humanity doesn't lose. The Spite Core was a thing of raw, untamed power. It was an artifact born from the very spirit of defiance, the unyielding heart of humanity. And now, it was their last hope. Zhao connected her suit's systems to the core. Her fingers trembled as she began the sequence. The pulse of energy increased, rippling through the station's failing infrastructure. The walls trembled as the core's energy flooded every corner of the station. Vance watched the readout on his visor, eyes narrowing. The core was amplifying, feeding off their anger, their desperation. Humanity's will to survive was turning into a weapon. One that the Qatari couldn't understand. And then, without warning, it exploded. The power surged, crackling through the air like a storm. The Qatari soldiers outside screamed, their bodies disintegrating in an instant as the wave of energy shot outward from the core. But it wasn't just the Qatari who were affected. The very fabric of the station seemed to convulse, the walls creaking and groaning under the pressure. "We've got to go now," Morales shouted, her voice a scream of terror. The Prometheus was ready, its engines firing up with a deep, resonating hum. The station was breaking apart and every second counted. But the core wasn't finished. It wasn't just a weapon. It was a force. The Qatari had underestimated it, just as they had underestimated humanity. The energy blasted outward, filling the vacuum of space with a violent shockwave that sent ripples through the nearby Qatari fleet. Their ships faltered for a moment, their systems flickering as they tried to recover from the sheer power of the blast. "Prometheus," Vance muttered under his breath, watching the Qatari warships reel from the wave of energy. The ship had to get out of there before the final implosion of the station sent them all to oblivion. The Qatari flagship, the heart of their fleet, suddenly shifted course. It had been damaged, but not destroyed. Not yet. The flagship's guns opened fire, a blistering wave of plasma that arced toward the Prometheus. The Qatari were relentless, and even with their own forces crippled, they would not let humanity escape so easily. "Take the shot, Reyes," Vance yelled, turning toward the cockpit. "We're not leaving this to chance." Reyes was already on it. Her fingers danced across the controls, and the ship's weapon systems powered up. A pulse of blue energy shot from the ship's cannons, slamming into the Qatari flagship. The impact sent a shockwave through the station, causing the already unstable infrastructure to buckle further. But the flagship didn't go down. Instead, it retaliated with a devastating strike. The Prometheus rocked violently as the blast hit its shields. Sparks flew from the console and alarms blared through the ship's corridors. The Qatari flagship had managed to hit them square in the hull. The shields were starting to fail. "We're not out of this yet," Morales yelled, her voice sharp with panic. "The Qatari are coming." Vance's mind raced. He knew they couldn't keep trading shots with the flagship. But that wasn't the only problem. The Spite Core was destabilizing faster now, its energy output increasing in dangerous waves. It was no longer just a weapon. It was a ticking time bomb. Zhao, struggling to maintain control over the core, glanced at Vance. "We have to leave now. The core is pushing its limits. If we don't—" "I know." Vance cut her off, but his mind was already calculating. He couldn't risk the core going critical. He had to make the decision now. He turned toward the ship's communications console. "Reyes, get us out of here. Full speed, now." Reyes didn't hesitate. She slammed the throttle forward, and the Prometheus shot away from the station, engines screaming as the ship tore through the debris field. The Qatari flagship gave chase, but the human ship was faster, far faster. The station, however, was still collapsing. The core had built up too much energy. The pulse that had sent the Qatari reeling now threatened to tear the station apart completely. "We're not going to make it," Morales said, her voice trembling with fear. She turned to Vance, her face tight with worry. "The core, it's going to explode if we don't get far enough away." "We're going," Vance replied, his voice steady. "Hold on." The Prometheus was already moving into the escape trajectory. But as the ship left the station's atmosphere, Vance turned his gaze back toward the massive structure behind them. The core's energy was reaching its peak. The station began to shudder violently. Then, with a deafening roar, it detonated. The shockwave of the explosion sent ripples through the vacuum of space, tearing apart the Qatari warships in its path. Their once imposing fleet was reduced to debris in an instant. But the shockwave reached the Prometheus, and even though they had managed to escape the worst of it, the ship was tossed violently in space. The Prometheus groaned as it fought to regain control. Systems flickering. Sparks shot from the control panels. The crew was thrown forward, their harnesses straining against their bodies. But they were alive. The Qatari flagship was gone. The station was gone. And humanity? Humanity had won. But as Vance gazed out into the infinite void, something inside him began to change. They had survived. But at what cost? The victory was bittersweet. The Qatari had been defeated, but the core had left a scar on the very fabric of space itself. There were no simple answers, no clear-cut victories. Humanity had fought back against impossible odds, and survived. But the future, it was still unwritten. The silence of space was deafening. Even the Prometheus seemed to hold its breath as it drifted through the wreckage of what had once been the Qatari fleet. Broken ships floated in the black void, some spinning slowly, others torn apart by the cataclysmic energy wave. But none of that mattered. The battle was over. Humanity had won. Vance stared out of the viewport, his eyes tracing the lines of debris that once belonged to the Qatari flagship, the symbol of their invincibility. His face was grim, the weight of their victory settling over him like a shroud. There was no celebration, no triumph. Only a quiet, uneasy peace. "Captain," Zhao's voice crackled through the comms. She sounded weary, her usual confidence tempered by the exhaustion of what they had just endured. We've stabilized the core, for now." Vance didn't reply at first. He simply stared into the vastness of space, a void so deep, so consuming that even their victory felt small and fragile in comparison. "The core's unstable, Zhao. We need to figure out how to control it before it causes more damage," Vance said, his voice low, thoughtful. "The Qatari might be gone, but the universe is still full of unknowns. That energy, it's dangerous." "We don't have much time," she responded. "I'm working on recalibrating the systems, but the core is feeding off more than just our power now. It's reacting to the emotions we felt when we used it. The rage, the fear, the desperation. That's what made it so powerful." Vance let out a long sigh, feeling the weight of her words. The core had been their weapon, their salvation, but it was also their greatest risk. They had used it to strike down the Qatari, to defy a force that had taken so many lives across the galaxy. But what came after? Could they really control something born from such raw, untamed power? "Do you think we can contain it?" he asked, his voice quieter now. Zhao paused. When she spoke again, her words were filled with uncertainty. I don't know. It's unlike anything I've ever seen. We may have to destroy it before it destroys us." Vance clenched his fists, the internal conflict gnawing at him. Destroy the core? After everything they had sacrificed? After the lives lost in the fight? Could he really let go of the one thing that had turned the tide? But even more troubling was the question of what they would be destroying. They had used the core as a weapon, yes. But they had also tapped into something far greater, a deeper part of themselves that refused to bow to invaders. The human spirit. Their will to survive. To live. The ship's proximity alarms rang out, breaking his reverie. The Prometheus had entered the edge of the gravitational pull of a nearby planet, a large, barren world, its surface scarred by ancient wars and forgotten civilizations. Vance blinked, coming back to reality. "Captain, we need to decide. We can't keep running. The Qatari won't be the last empire to try and crush us." Morales' voice came through the comms, firm and steady. "We need to figure out what we're doing with the core now." Vance stood up, his boots clanging against the deck as he walked toward the central command. His mind was racing. The Spite Core was humanity's power, but it was also an unpredictable force, like a weapon without a master. They had won the battle, yes, but what about the war? Could they use the core to unite the galaxy? Or would it drive them down a path of destruction, like every other force they had ever faced? His crew was watching him, waiting for direction. They had placed their trust in him through this whole ordeal. They had followed him to the brink of annihilation and back, and now they needed to know if the captain would lead them to safety or to ruin. "We'll take it one step at a time," Vance finally said, his voice full of resolve. "We'll get to a safe distance, and then we'll figure out what to do with the core. It's too dangerous to just leave lying around, but we can't destroy it either. Not yet." Zhao's voice came through, tinged with both relief and concern. "Captain, I'll keep working on a containment system. We may be able to stabilize it long enough to figure out how to use it responsibly, but I need time." "I'll give you all the time you need," Vance replied. "Just make sure it doesn't blow up in our faces before then." The Prometheus drifted toward the planet below, its engines humming as the crew worked to regain their bearings. For the first time since they had left Earth, Vance allowed himself a moment to breathe. There were no Qatari warships chasing them, no battles to fight, only the vast, empty space stretching before them. Morales approached him, her face softened by the exhaustion of the battle. "You know, Captain, for all the odds we were up against, I never doubted we'd make it out. Humans always figure out a way." Vance chuckled dryly, his eyes flicking over the crew members who were still making adjustments to the ship's systems. "It's not that we figure it out, Morales, it's that we keep pushing until we can't anymore. And when we're at the breaking point, we find a way to snap back." She smiled, her tired eyes reflecting the bond they shared. "Guess that's what makes us human, huh?" He nodded, but there was a heaviness in his heart. "Yeah, but it's not just about surviving anymore. It's about what we do with that survival. The core showed us how strong we can be, but it also showed us what we could lose." The planet below remained silent, untouched by the war that had raged in space just moments ago. It was a wasteland, but it was a place where they could rest and regroup. For the first time in days, Vance felt the pull of sleep, the weight of their battle finally catching up to him. But even as he closed his eyes for a moment of rest, he knew that humanity's struggle was far from over. The galaxy had learned to fear them, but now they had to learn how to control what they had unleashed. They couldn't afford to become like the Qatari. The universe was a vast, unknowable place, and humanity was just beginning to understand its place in it. As the Prometheus set its course for the distant stars, Vance stood at the helm, watching the planet shrink behind them. He thought of Earth, of all the generations that had fought to get them this far, and he thought of the Spite Core, its power still growing within their ship. Humanity had always been a force of nature, but now they had something more. The question was, what would they do with it? The stars stretched endlessly in all directions, silent witnesses to the drama that had unfolded across the galaxy. The Prometheus coasted through the emptiness, its engines quiet for the moment. Inside, the crew was at rest, but not in peace. Even in the quiet aftermath, the questions remained. The Spite Core still hummed with untamed energy, a reminder of the power they had harnessed and the potential destruction it could bring. Vance stood at the observation deck, his hands resting against the cold glass, staring out at the black void. He could almost feel the weight of the universe pressing in on him. The Qatari were gone. For now, humanity had won. But at what cost? The war had never been about just survival. It had been about something deeper, something more dangerous. The power to shape the future was now in their hands. But power, as they had learned, was a double-edged sword. "We'll need to be careful," Zhao's voice came from behind him, breaking his thoughts. She stepped up beside him, her expression unreadable, the exhaustion from their battle still lingering in her eyes. "The core's not stable and we don't know enough about it yet. But I've made some progress. It's like nothing we've ever seen before. The energy it generates, it's alive in a way. It's reactive. Sentient almost." Vance didn't turn to her. "You said we could control it." "I didn't say we could control it," Zhao replied. "I said we might. But we're not the only ones who are watching. The Qatari weren't the first to take notice of the core. And they won't be the last." Vance finally turned, meeting her eyes. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that the galaxy's full of eyes. Old ones, ancient ones. And the core, it's calling to them." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched out, heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. The universe had already begun to react to humanity's new weapon. What had been a victory was beginning to feel more like a challenge, an invitation for something greater to come. And when the universe called, it was never in a language anyone could understand at first. From across the room, Rhea spoke up, her voice a mixture of relief and uncertainty. "We've detected a signal. It's faint, but it's there. And it's coming from the other side of the galaxy." Vance's heart skipped a beat. "A signal?" "Not just any signal," Rhea said, eyes glued to her console. "It's encrypted, but the pattern, it matches the core's energy signature." Zhao's face tightened. "It's them." "Who?" Vance asked, stepping closer. "The ones who made the core," Zhao answered, her voice barely a whisper. "The ones who knew how to control it, but didn't." Vance felt a chill run through him. The story was only just beginning. As the Prometheus adjusted its course, the stars outside shifted slightly, their paths now leading toward a future unknown, a future filled with the kind of power that could reshape the galaxy itself. And as the ship hurtled toward the signal source, Vance knew that humanity's struggle wasn't over. The Qatari were just the beginning. And in the deep, uncharted darkness, something else was waiting. Something far older, far more powerful, and far more dangerous than they could ever have imagined. The questions were just beginning, but Vance had one certainty left. Humanity's fate would never again be determined by anyone but them.